So we're continuing our discussion in the primary witnesses. So witnesses in the original language and the original context. Mainly the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Masoretic text, and today we'll be focusing on the Dead Sea Scrolls. We touched upon them briefly last time. They're found around the Dead Sea, and all come, or at least the majority come, between 200 BC and 100 AD. The majority come from a place called Qumran. You can see the remnants of it here. And these were Jews that lived out in the middle of nowhere. They thought the Messiah would come to venerate them and their ideas, overthrow Rome, and take care of the Gentiles, and establish a pure priesthood. Now, we know a lot of this because they wrote many books. So we found copies of Scripture there, but we also found their own books, their own scrolls. So these were most likely people called Essenes, or water drinkers, or daily bathers. They had, a few different names depending on who was writing about them. They were one of three different schools of thought amongst the Jews. So they all basically separated about the mid-2nd century BC, 150s. We have the Pharisees, which we know from the New Testament. They had control of the synagogues. So they were the populist movement. We had the Sadducees. They are the ones in control of the temple. They were backed by the rich. They had support of the rich. But while they had all that power and control, since they didn't have the heart of the people, they had to basically give in to the Pharisees, and so there was kind of a tug-of-war of the power there as far as the Jewish community went. And then you had the Essenes. They were in control of nothing out in the middle of nowhere. Now, these are the main three. There were other groups. We had the Hellenists and the Zealots, but those are kind of interdispersed amongst the big three. Now, the Essenes had many of the same beliefs as other Jews. And so they weren't completely different, but they were a little different, the same way the Sadducees and the Pharisees were a little different. They had beliefs that were not in accordance with the law of Moses, such as their views against marriage. They did not look upon marriage fondly. Some were very against it. Some said it was okay, but not really something that you should give a lot of your time to. So they were kind of odd about that. They're also heavily focused on ritual purity. So they had what are called mikvahs. These are basically baptistries. In the first century Jewish culture, daily ritual cleansing with a baptistry was very common. And so you can see some of them. I think those are them there. This one, pretty sure. But they had numerous ones all over Qumran. And as you can imagine, without plumbing, without chlorine, without a lot of the daily things that we use to keep this thing from getting all nasty, it led to a lot of sickness. And so a thing that was supposed to make them clean made them dirty because they weren't, doing it properly. But they had a few ideas, especially about the priesthood as well. So they broke from the main sect of Judaism during the Hasmonean period. So again, 150s BC. If you remember, this was the group that went and destroyed the Samaritan temple because they didn't like them because the high priest was also kind of the king. And those were two offices that should not be joined, according to the Essenes. And so they had some issues with that. So they kind of had their own priestly routines, priestly habits, sacrifices, and such. They would even have what is called a messianic banquet. So you can see the remnants of it here. So they had sought to establish a pure priesthood from the line of Zadok. This was the priest of the time of Solomon, a descendant of Phinehas, who had that covenant of peace mentioned back in the, I think it was, I'm going to remember the wrong book, I think it was Joshua, but I could be mistaken. But so they were holding to his priesthood, or the trying to. They said that, no, the Hasmoneans had it wrong, we have it right. And according to their Messianic rule scroll, this is how the Messianic banquet would go. The priest shall enter at the head of all the congregation of Israel and all his brethren, the sons of Aaron, the priests who are invited to the feast, men of renown, and they shall sit before him, each according to his importance. Afterward, the Messiah of Israel shall enter, and the heads of the thousands of Israel shall sit before him, each according to his importance. No one shall extend his hand to the first portion of the bread and the wine before the priest, for he shall extend his hand first. Afterwards, the Messiah of Israel shall extend his hand to the bread, and so on. So they had a very ritualized kind of meal here. They also stressed divine sovereignty. So Josephus, writing about the Essenes, says, "But the sect of the Essenes affirm that the fate governs all things, and that nothing befalls men but what is according to its determination." And they also had a very strong attachment to a religious calendar. So this was a calendar of 364 days, 12 months, 30 months per day. Now, one of the problems with this calendar is that there was no method for correction. And so after each year, it would be off basically a day and a quarter. So after 150 years or so, it would be completely 180. What was originally winter is now spring, and so on with this calendar. Today, our calendar system is also a solar calendar, but it has a correction in there. The Jews of the Old Testament had a lunar calendar, and they would have a correction system based upon the barley harvest. Now, this calendar was very important to them. It was focused on Pentecost, and it held that no event in the Bible could have happened on a Sabbath. You couldn't even fast on a Sabbath. And so this was probably one of the main issues why they may not have had Esther there. We don't know exactly why they didn't have Esther. At least we haven't found a copy of it in Qumran. But in Esther, we have the holiday of Purim established. And according to their calendar, at least, that would have been on a Sabbath. They may have also had some issues with her marriage to a Gentile. They were very keen on that as well. But they really held their calendar in high esteem. They also held to some of the books as near canonical, or perhaps canonical in the sense of Jubilees. So they had Jubilees, the Testament of Moses, and 1st Enoch. While the Testament of Moses and 1st Enoch, we don't have any evidence that they held those as canonical, they did quote Jubilees as scripture once. And so we'll be getting into these books at a later date when we cover the pseudepigrapha, but for now, just know that they had some other ideas and some other books that they held in high esteem. If you want to know more about some of their beliefs, we have some quotes from Josephus here. It is a collection of quotes from various writings of his as far as what the Essenes believed, what they did, and such. Now, Josephus was not an Essene, he was a Pharisee, but he was very good about giving the truth and the warts when he talked about things. So if you want to know more about that, that's one way of doing it. But as far as the scrolls, we have about 230 biblical books, 6 of them with portions of 2 books, and 1 scroll with a portion of 3 books. And a notable fact is that a lot of these would have been within a few generations of the original, meaning that basically one of these books could have been copied from the original. It's not very likely, but it's possible, because scrolls would last for 1, 2, maybe even 300 years. And this is very similar to what we see in the New Testament as far as the historical record. Now, the big question is were these very close to the Masoretic text, which our Bible is based upon? Now, this is a very general estimate, but 60% is perfectly identical. An extra 20% is slightly different, mainly due to spelling changes, and that's going to happen with any language, especially over a millennia. Of the remaining 20%, about 5% of these readings agree with the Septuagint, 5% with the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the remaining 10 basically from several other traditions. Now, this seems kind of scary at first because, wait a minute, this is all kind of odd. Why is it so different? These differences don't really make a difference to the text, and we'll be going over some of these here in a bit. Now, the reason why some of these little differences that don't really make a difference may be in there is because these Essenes were separate from mainstream Judaism. They were separate from the temple. They didn't hold to the priests. They probably didn't hold to some other things, and as such, they probably got a lot of their texts from everywhere. You have the Jews down in Alexandria, they may have gotten some texts from. The Jews back in Babylon, they got some texts from. Maybe some Jews in the Palestinian area, but we don't know. But it could be that the reason why we have some of these differences there is because they were just getting anything to get their hands on, not the ones that have been well preserved in the temple. But these scrolls are very, very similar as far as the true meaning, as far as what they actually say. We'll be going over these here in a bit again. So these are the numbers of copies that we have found. Now, you can see some we have a lot of, some we have few of. Overall, though, these are not really full copies. Most of these are fragments. That is not to say we don't have full copies. We have 4 books in full. We have Isaiah, Obadiah, Jonah, and Nahum. If you want to get more involved as far as what these scrolls actually say, you can go to this website right here, and it has the highlighted differences, spelling changes, if a word could not be fully read, etc. It is very detailed, very easy to understand, and it has it both by book, chapter, verse, as well as per scroll. So you can go through and actually see what these scrolls said in English. You can also go here and see the Isaiah scroll actually rolled out. And when you hover over a verse, it will highlight it and tell you which verse that is, so you can actually zoom in and see the verse. But very useful, very helpful, free websites, free resources you have. And that scroll of Isaiah is called the Great Isaiah Scroll. It's dated to be about 125 BC. It is very similar to the Aleppo Codex 1,000 years later, with basically just spelling alterations, spelling changes. And we're going to be going into this scroll here in just a few moments. So, since I don't have a lot of other hobbies, evidently, or whatnot, I went through and took that website and got numbers based upon the verses that we have of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you want that Excel sheet, because you also need another hobby, let me know and I can send it to you. But overall, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain about 35% of the Old Testament verses. 7,700 of the 21-something thousand verses in our Old Testament. Of those 7,700, 17.9% have a variation. Most of these variations are spelling differences, the addition, subtraction of the word and, a translocation of word, meaning that the word switched. So instead of saying Lord Yahweh, it was Yahweh Lord, for example. And most of these are not really translatable, so it's very difficult to see them when we translate it over to English. That gives us to about 1.6% of those 7,000 some verses having a meaningful variation, meaning that it can change the meaning of the verse. Doesn't mean it does, but you can make an argument that it does. So that means that 98.4% of the Dead Sea Scrolls compared to the Masoretic text have no notable changes over 1,000 years. Now, there is the question is, since these are older, should we take these readings? So that 1.6%, is that more accurate than what we have? And no. Basically, these witnesses need to be weighed, need to be examined, verse by verse, variant by variant, like any other witness. Just because they're older doesn't mean they're better. And we'll be going through some reasons why that is the case. Another issue is that the Essenes, like I said, were kind of a non-mainstream sect of Judaism. They had some disagreements with the temple. And because of this, they may have been more prone to error. They may have gotten their texts any which way they can, maybe some poor quality texts. And the Jews at the time, based upon the rabbinic literature, had a sort of correction process. So it was either in the temple or funded by the temple. And it's a question whether or not the Essenes would have used such a service to make corrections, since they had disagreements with the temple. And so we definitely have to weigh this evidence, especially in light of what we know of the Essenes. So we're going to go through the most ideal case study. So this is basically, since Isaiah is a whole book and a very large book, it is more prone to variance. The more verses you have, the more likely you are to get a change. And since it is a complete scroll, we can see all the verses. So some sections of Scripture are more prone to errors than others. It's just what we see as far as the historical record. And then in addition to this whole scroll, we have about 67.88% of the book found through a variety of other fragments. So if we take the fragments, the whole scroll of Isaiah, that brings us to about 435 translatable variants found, so 33.67% of the verses in Isaiah. Not in just one scroll, but through all the copies we have. That's 22 copies, not just the Great Isaiah Scroll. Now, while these are translatable, they don't necessarily affect the meaning of the verse, such as putting and in there, or so. We have the addition of and. We have a switching of the third person pronoun with a noun, or vice versa. So one verse said bread flour, and then the variant was it. It was already talking about bread flour, so I just put it in there. We have repetition of lines, such as where David encamped, then where David encamped again. We have switching Lord for Yahweh, so not just switching places, but replacing the word Lord for Yahweh or vice versa. We have switching of plural to singular, such as in the case of God's hand will versus God's hands will. So it doesn't really change the meaning. If we're anthropomorphizing God, we have two hands. It fits the analogy. We also have the gates to your gates when speaking of Jerusalem. Doesn't change the context. And we have some near synonyms of words. We have one called to another versus they were calling each other. Doesn't change the meaning. So when we separate out some of these, that gives us 15 meaningful variants in 20 verses. You can see them here. So we'll be going through these today. If we're looking at just the Great Isaiah Scroll, that gives us 13 variants in 17 verses. So about 1.2%. So bring out your book of Isaiah because we're going to be going through each of these. The first one is in Isaiah 2, verse 9. This is what the Great Isaiah Scroll says. Man is brought low, and mankind is humbled. The proud look of humanity will be brought low, and the arrogance of people will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted on that day. So whenever you see it in green, that's a change. If a line is through it, it means that it is not in the text. So this is what R says. The line through it means the Dead Sea Scroll does not have it. If you see green but no line through it, that means it was added in. So that means ours does not have it, but the Dead Sea Scroll does. So this is the variant, the first one. Now, we do not understand why this variant happened. There's no scribal error that we can see that would obviously explain this. But we do have two other copies of the Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls that do not agree with this. They agree with what our Bibles have. In addition to that, the other ancient translations do not have this as well. They agree with what the Masoretic text says. So while we cannot explain this, every other piece of evidence, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, does not hold to this reading. So this is most likely not the original with all this other evidence against it. There is no other evidence for this reading in plenty for what our Bibles have. Any questions on this verse? The next one is in chapter 4, 5, and 6. And in this one, the and up here is being added in. We're not concerned about that. That is a common mistake, a common variant, and it doesn't really change, the same way I'm putting and a lot in my words. Now, it may look like there's two, but in the Hebrew, by day would be a cloud by day and smoke. And so this is just one section. So even though in English we separate them out for better English, it's just one section that is missing, not two sections. And so the Dead Sea Scroll reads, "And Yahweh will create over the whole habitation of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, and for a refuge and for a shelter from the storm and from the rain." So what is happening here is most likely called a haplography. So basically it's an eye jump. So the day in here in verse 4 to the daytime here in verse 6. Day and daytime in the Hebrew is the same word, yamem. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's close, I hope. So what happened is the scribe was going through, copying. He looks up, sees daytime, writes down daytime or day, looks back up, goes to the wrong day here, and then continues on. And again, we do not have any other variants, any other readings that support this variant. Another Dead Sea Scroll of that time does not have this. It has what our Masoretic text has, as well as all the ancient translations as well. So any question as far as this variant goes? All right. Next we have chapter 16, 8 and 9. The Dead Sea Scroll reads, "For the fields of Heshbon languish with the vine of Simba. I will water you with my tears, Heshbon and Eliah, for on your summer fruits and on your harvest the battle shout has fallen." This is a little bit more easy to see in the English because it is also a haplography. The vine of Simba, the vine of Simba. Copying down the vine of Simba. All right, look back up. The vine of Simba, I will water you. Very easy mistake to make, very common mistake. And again, another Dead Sea Scroll does not have this variant in it, agrees with the Masoretic text, as well as every single ancient translation. So, not likely the original. Next we have any questions on this one before we go to the next? Okay. Next we have chapter 22, verse 5. This is the first one that isn't just a removal, but a change. So here we have these words removed and these words added. So the Dead Sea Scroll reads, "For it is a day of confusion, and of treading down, and of perplexity from the Lord, Yahweh of armies, in the valley of vision, a breaking down of his holiness on the mountains." Now, unlike the others, we do not have any other copies of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls that have this verse. So we don't know any other witnesses from the same time period. The Vulgate in the AD 400s actually has a combination of these two readings. It says, "the walls of his holiness on the mountains." This is a common thing that scribes did when they had two readings. Sometimes they would take one reading and the other. They couldn't figure out which one was original, so they just put them both in. And so it seems that both of these variants were in existence, at least in the AD 400s when the Vulgate was written. The Septuagint and the Targums, the Aramaic translation, not really very helpful because they go very paraphrastic. They're doing meaning for meaning, not word for word. And as such, they don't use either the walls, crying, or holiness. So we don't know what their translation said. The Peshitta, the Syriac version, does have what the Masoretic text says. "The walls and he cried out on the mountains." So the question is, why is there a change here? And which one is more likely? So what most likely happened here is that the scribe looked at one thing and saw something else. So in the Hebrew, you have two words here, the walls, crying. But if you put them together without a space between them here, so 1, 2, space, 4, it looks very similar to his holiness. You can see basically the same thing, except this letter and this letter look very similar, though are not the same. And this is what is written in the great Isaiah scroll in this point. So his holiness in the scroll, that's that word. And you can see it's not spelled the same. These two letters are switched, and that would also fit with this letter here. So you can see that it's very easy for a scribe to look at this word and maybe read this word in it. So again, a common scribal error that we see. So most likely, the walls and the crying is the original based upon other translations and an easy to understand error. It's very hard to go from this to this, but easy to go from this to this. So any questions on that? Okay. Next, we have chapter 23. Verse 15, the Dead Sea Scroll reads, "It will come to pass in that day that Tyre will be like in the song of the prostitute." Another haplography, thankfully, easy to see even in the English, Tyre to Tyre. Now, there are many reasons why a scribe might do that. But in this case, we know one reason why he didn't do that. We know he didn't do this because he was too tired, because he only wrote down one Tyre. That was a joke, sorry. So, again, we have other copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Isaiah, that do not agree with this, that agree with the Masoretic text. And we have all the translations again, so this is likely not the original. Any questions on that? All right. Next, we have chapter 29. The Dead Sea Scroll reads, "You'll be brought down, and your speech will whisper." Now, I don't know if you can see that there's a slight coloration variant there. That's because "and your speech" is not legible. That is being inserted in there, but is not actually legible in the scroll, because this is not the great Isaiah scroll. This is another Isaiah scroll. And so what the scroll says is, "You'll be brought down, will whisper." That's what we can actually read in the scroll. So the reason why the verse may not be in the scroll is because that's the scroll. So right after verse 4, there is a major break in the translation because there's no verse. I don't know which of these fragments it is, but it appears that this is most likely due to the bad state of the scroll. We also have two other scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Great Isaiah Scroll for one, that has the Masoretic text reading, as well as all the ancient translations. So again, most likely not the original. Any questions on this one? All right. Next, we have chapter 34. This is actually 3, though "be dissolved" and "fade away" are near synonyms, so we're not really too concerned about that one. So it's really 2 that we're going to be focusing on here. 34:4, "And the deep places will be split, and all of the army of the sky will fade away. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll, and all its armies will fade away as a leaf fades from the vine of a fig tree, or a fig tree. For my sword will be seen in the sky. Behold, it will come down on Edom and on the people of my curse for judgment. Now, no other Dead Sea Scroll has these verses. In fact, it doesn't have the entire chapter 34. This is the only copy of 34 that we have. And the Septuagint, the Vulgate, and the Targums all agree with the Masoretic texts. The Peshitta, the Syriac, though, while it does lack this one, it does not have this, it does have will be seen, not has drunk its fill. And so there is a little bit of support through the Peshitta for this variant. But there is no other support for this. So this is most likely an addition. Don't know why it was put in there, but most likely a variant that was not the original. As far as has drunk its fill and will be seen, this may be another case of a mistaken word. So you can see the word shall be made drunk. This is from a few verses down in the same scroll, and this is what is written in verse 5 there. So you can see similar. If you bunch these letters up a little bit, it's going to look very much like this. And then this may look like this first part of this letter and then the same last letter. So if a scribe was working in poor lighting, or if there was some damage to the scroll there where it was kind of blotched or had an extra little line, you could easily mistake, and it doesn't really change the context, so you can see how a scribe might see it will be seen versus it has drunk its fill. But again, most of the evidence has for it's drunk its fill, in which case that is most likely the original. Any questions on this one? All right. Next, we go to chapter 38 and 20. Yahweh will save me, the living, he shall praise you as I do today. The Father shall make known your truth to the children. Therefore we will sing my song with stringed instruments all the days of our life in Yahweh's house. Now this one is most likely a repeated verse. Unlike most other repetitions, it is not right after, but has this little section in between the repetition. So 19 is this basically, part of 20, and then it puts 19 again before going on with verse 20. But still, just a repetition, easy to explain. Other copies of Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls do not have this. They agree with the Masoretic as well as all the ancient translations. Any question on this one? Right. Next, we'll be going to chapter 47, and this chapter is speaking of Babylon. We're not concerned about this so here, and not really too concerned about this you versus them. That is basically the same thing considering the context. And I did exclude this from the screen just because of spacing. So the scroll has everything between councils and save. The Dead Sea Scroll reads, "So stand now with your enchantments and with your multitude of your sorceries, in which you have labored from your youth and until this day, according to the multitude of your counsels, save you from the things that will come on them." And so we have a deletion here of these, and until this day, and according to inserted. Now the the Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah 1Q, Isaiah B, agrees with the Masoretic text, not this, as well as all the other ancient translations. Now again, this is one that we're not sure of why there was a change, but without any other supporting evidence, this is most likely not the original based upon all the other witnesses that we have. Any questions about that one? And I'm sorry if this is kind of getting a little bit into it, but I just want to show you that this is the worst of the worst. And it doesn't really change the meaning. They're mostly easy to explain except for a few, and then the evidence against those variants are very high. So this is basically a lot of what textual criticism is. This is how we can be very confident that what we have in our Bibles is the original. On to chapter 54, verse 17. "No weapon that is formed against you will prevail. This is the heritage of Yahweh's servants, and their righteousness is of me, says Yahweh." So we have another scroll of Isaiah, 5Q57, that agrees with the Masoretic texts, not this. Also, all the ancient translations agree with the Masoretic texts. And this is what the scroll actually looks like here. So here we have 17, it goes from right to left, prevail, a blank space, and then this. This is most likely because the scroll that the scribe of the great Isaiah scroll was copying from was damaged. So we see that a lot of the times if they see a damaged portion, they will leave a blank space and try to go and fill it in later. And we see examples of this in the Great Isaiah Scroll. Here we have chapter 35, 1 and 2. So you can see these two lines being put in the space of a single line. A lot smaller, a lot darker, and you can see them marking it on the in the columns there, or in between the columns, I should say. And here in chapter 37, 5 and 7, we have 3 lines put in the space of 2 lines. And this one, some of the scholars will say that I think it was this word down here, but I do not know for sure. They didn't highlight it in the article that I was reading. But it seems that the scribe was trying to write a word, stopped mid-word, and then went back in to fill that. And so this plus some things like this, so you can see an entire verse, 47, inserted here and goes down the column because they didn't leave enough space there. So this is most likely copied from a damaged exemplar, a damaged scroll. Potentially, these were all along the bottom of the scroll or the top of the scroll, which are most likely to get damaged. Again, the Essenes did not have, or most likely did not have, the best scrolls to copy from, since they were not joined with the temple. And a fun fact, these 4 dots represent the name Yahweh there. So they would sometimes put 4 dots in there to mean the name Yahweh. They'd also put 4 dots above a word or below a word to signify there's an error there. So they use dots for a lot of different things. But chapter 54:17 is most likely due to a damaged scroll that it was copied from, and they just failed to go in and put the correct reading, or the rest of the reading, I should say. Any questions on that one? All right. To 51:6, going back a little bit, 51:6 says, "Lift up your eyes to the heavens and look on the earth beneath, and see who created these things, and its inhabitants will die in the same way, but my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness will not be abolished." So here we have this 51:6 coming this way, and then right here at this line, we have all this missing, and then these words are, "and see who created these things, and its inhabitants," and so on. We have we do have another Isaiah scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls that agrees with the Masoretic texts, not this variant, as well as all the ancient translations. So we don't know the exact cause of this one, but there can be an argument made potentially for the damaged exemplar being the cause, but it's not as strong of evidence as the others. But again, we have a ton of evidence, even from the same time period, against this for the Masoretic text reading, and this is the only copy of this variant, so most likely not the original. Any questions on that one? I'm sorry for the people on this side that I'm not using this. It's just a little easier. I'll try to share it. I apologize. All right. Almost done. Now we're in chapter 60. So the Dead Sea Scroll, and this is not the Great Isaiah Scroll, this is another one. It reads, "The sun will be no more your light by day, nor will the brightness of the moon give you light, but Yahweh will be your everlasting light, and the day of your mourning will end." This is another haplography. Yep. I jumped. So it's another haplography going from everlasting light to everlasting light. We have 2 other scrolls that do not agree with this, that agree with the Masoretic texts, though this one does not have 19 because it is damaged. The Peshitta, though, does agree with this scroll. So that shows you how common this kind of jump is. It is a very common scribal mistake, something we have to look for. But it's very easily explained, and this is most likely not the original. Any questions on that one? All right. Next, chapter 63:3, the Dead Sea Scroll reads, "I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people no one was with me, and I have stained all my clothing." So we have another Dead Sea Scroll, Isaiah 1Q, I1Q Isaiah B, that does agree with the Masoretic texts, as well as the Vulgate, the Peshitta, and the Targums that all agree with the Masoretic text. The Septuagint, you can see here, does not really go with either. It kind of has its own paraphrastic translation, so it can't really help us either way. But still, all the evidence is against this reading. Now, we don't really know the cause, but again, no other evidence for it. All this evidence against it, most likely not the original reading. Any question on that one? All right. Now this one is 65, 15, and 16. "You will leave your name for a curse to my chosen, and the Lord Yahweh will kill you permanently. And it will be that he who swears by the God of truth, and it will be who swears in the earth will swear by the God of truth, etc. Now, we don't have any other Dead Sea Scrolls that have these verses of Isaiah, but the Septuagint, the Vulgate, the Targums, and the Peshitta all have the Masoretic reading, not this one. And this is, again, most likely due to the damaged exemplar. So here we have the entire line. Here is the word permanently, and here is the beginning of, and it will be that he who swears by. And so most likely they had a damaged line there, and they didn't go back and fix it. But what happens if you remove the permanently, and it will be that he who swears by? Then you have, and the Lord Yahweh will kill you, the God of truth. That doesn't really sound good to have in there. They didn't want to put that in there, so they put permanently, and then they copied a portion of 16 and put it up there, since we have God of truth, swear by the God of truth, swears by the God of truth. Just to make it seem like God is not killing himself. So this was, again, most likely due to the damaged exemplar, and they put that in there so God didn't kill God. They held any kind of error like that in very high esteem, or very poor esteem, I should say, and they didn't want to put that in there. Any questions on that one? All right. So that was our last one. So we have 15 variants and 20 verses out of 22 copies of the Dead Sea Scroll. So if we take it from all the verses we have, that's less than 1%. Even if you were to take all those variants and put it in a single scroll, a single copy, that would still only be 1.2% of verses. For of them, 7 verses can be explained by the haplography, the jumping of the I from one word to the same word a little bit further on. We have 1 to 2 that are mistaken words. We have a repeated verse. We have 2 from the damaged exemplar, and 1 from the scroll itself being damaged, leaving us with 5 variants and 7 verses with unknown causes. So just focus on them then. That means we have 0.3% of the verses in the 22 Dead Sea Scrolls that have an unexplained variant, or about 0.5% if we were to try and merge all those into a single copy. Of those 5 variants, all of them, at least all these 4, have other Dead Sea Scrolls that go against that agree with the Masoretic text, as well as all the other ancient translations. So no evidence for the variant, the Dead Sea Scroll, all the evidence for what our Bibles have in them. The last one, 34:4, we don't have any other Dead Sea Scrolls, but still, all the other ancient translations do not agree with that. They agree with the Masoretic text. So again, most likely not the original translation. Even then, it doesn't really affect the passage as a whole. It doesn't really change the meaning. So no doctrine of Scripture is altered. So we're going from 200 BC, 100 AD, to 1,000 years later. This shows that the Masoretic text, the basis of our Old Testament today, was incredibly well preserved, near miraculously preserved as far as the words in it. These works are near identical, with the majority of the differences being spelling. Other variants are not translatable, and the additional variants don't change the meaning of the verse. Excuse me. So when we weigh the witnesses to Isaiah, we see that few pieces of evidence for these readings. Much of the evidence against these readings, such as mainly scribal errors, other Dead Sea Scrolls, and all the other ancient translations agreeing with the Masoretic texts for most of them. That leaves us with a single verse, Isaiah 34:4, with an unsure cause, no other Dead Sea Scrolls of the verse, yet no piece of information besides that supports it, and all the other evidence that we have as far as that verse going against it with what our Bibles have. So I hope that this was enlightening to see that we can be very confident as far as our Old Testament, that over 1,000 years we saw very little change. Of those changes, most of them are common scribal errors that can be easily explained, and then we can use the vast amount of evidence that we have to understand what the original was. So do you all have any questions about all that right now?
I was going to say it's kind of cool to see the number of spaces that they left. So then we kind of have that insight to know, oh, we know that we need something here. And so that even, it's like you're getting into the mind of that scribe
Mm-hmm.
and saying, okay, I don't have everything I need to find that later, or when they added it in.
Mm.
So it's cool to see those things. So thanks for adding the picture.
And like I said, you can go to one of those websites and actually see that. That's where I got those pictures from. They left spacing for other reasons, such as paragraphing and such. They also had little marks on the side that they would denote this was a messianic passage or not. And so it's really cool, all the things that the scribes did, especially to preserve it.
Several times you referenced, okay, disagrees with, this supports, or the Masoretic text that we do have supports this. And I think there's a visual here. When I look at a picture of an old scroll, and it looks like 70% of it missing, right? I'm just thinking, oh, wow, we just have so little. But the point is not that we don't have that at all. We have more recent scrolls with that material in it.
Mhm.
It's just that the pieces that we do have, like 150 BC, still agree with, and still, for the large part, support. I mean, really, essentially, do support what we have in our newer manuscripts, and we would have full copies of.
Mhm.
Is that better?
Yeah, and so we don't have all the Old Testament in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we can use what we do have to show how well that the Jews and the Masoretes, who later copied, preserved it. It is near identical, near unheard of as far as ancient texts. The textual tradition, the copying process was superb. These people really cared about preservation, and it's still cool to see all this stuff. For example, we have Isaiah. We have all those passages, all those chapters in Isaiah that point to Jesus as if it was almost written after the fact, yet here it is 100, 150 years before Christ. And so you don't have that, oh, they added to it later kind of argument anymore. We know that this stuff was written prior to Christ. And so it gives us so much information, so much things that we can do and use to show people the truth. But yeah, it's incredible that they just preserved it so well. And so we can be confident because of what we do have, to then be confident in what we don't have as far as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Any other comments, questions, or concerns? All right. Well, next time, Lord willing, Matt will be going through some of the secondary witnesses, the Septuagint, and then perhaps the Vulgate if we have time. But thank you.